My name is Rachel Carr. I'm 45 years old. To the United States Navy, I'm Rear Admiral Carr, a woman who has commanded warships through hurricane zones, authorized classified operations, and earned every bar on my shoulder the hard way. But to my family, I've always been just the difficult one, the one who left, the one who made things uncomfortable. The message came just before midnight. My phone lit up with that familiar tone, once something I used to look forward to now, no different than being called out in a cold, sterile meeting room. Do you have something more appropriate to wear? Don't wear your uniform, it's embarrassing. 10 words. No hello? No? Did you make it in safely? Definitely, no, we can't wait to see you. Just a clean, neat little cut, dressed up as good manners. I stared at the screen like I might find something else hidden between the lines. But there wasn't. It was exactly what it looked like. The way my mother could deliver the most cutting blow without ever raising her voice. I hit call. A reflex that hadn't fully died, even after all these years of trying to keep some thread of connection alive. One ring. Then, straight to voicemail. The kind that had never been set up with a real greeting, just the automated voice impersonal and hollow, like I was one of hundreds of people who didn't matter. I hesitated, then hung up. I didn't leave a message. A few days earlier, Eliza had texted, "I told Mom to invite you. As long as you don't make things complicated." I stared at that message, not quite believing what I was reading. I almost said it out loud. What the hell complicated? That's what I was now. I'm her sister. I'm the woman who spent 22 years in the Navy, who stood through endless nights in command rooms and on ship decks while storms raged around us. The one who flew in overnight from California and drove straight from base just to be here. And still to them, I was just a potential problem. Part of me wanted to turn the car around. Don't go. They never really wanted you there anyway. But then another voice rose louder, steadier. You have to go. Not for them, for you. I needed them to see that I was no longer the 20-year-old girl who swallowed her hurt in silence. I had stood through storms, and this time I wasn't going to bow my head. The wedding invitation had come in a thick cream envelope, no handwriting, no return address. A mass-produced card with the kind of font you'd find in a bridal magazine. No note, no hope you'll come. Just logistics, venue, time, dress code. The invitation felt more like a set of directions for a stranger than a heartfelt welcome for someone in the family. That morning, I stood in front of the closet, staring down two options, a beige wrap dress I hadn't worn in years, and my service dress whites. One screamed, "I'm trying not to make a scene," the other was my skin. I picked the uniform, laid it carefully across the bed, and then walked away. Back again. Beige, uniform, beige, uniform. It didn't matter. Nothing I wore would make me part of the picture. My hands hovered over the collar of the uniform, feeling the fine line of stitching, like it meant something more than fabric. It held years. It held storms, sunrises on the deckhands of men I pulled back from death, and every minute I spent earning the stripes. But that history had never fit in my family's photo frame. There were other days like this, too many to count. The spelling bee I won in 5th grade where no one came to clap. The high school scholarship banquet where I posed alone with the principal while other students beamed beside proud parents. Even Annapolis, 2 empty seats and a text message after the ceremony. Eliza's tournament ran long. Hope it was nice. Like I had chosen a military academy over her soccer game just to be spiteful. It wasn't just the uniform they didn't want to see. It was what it said, that I'd become someone without needing them. That I'd left, survived, even succeeded. Maybe that was the real embarrassment. My car hugged the coast of Maine as I made my way to the venue. The sun glinted off the Atlantic like it was winking at someone else. Waves crashed against the rocks below, loud, rhythmic, insistent. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. The road was clean, the kind that seems endless, but every turn reminded me I was still on the same loop. There was a moment, as I passed a small harbour, where it almost felt okay. The water shimmered. The sky stretched out like it had room for me. And I let myself believe for just a second that maybe this time would be different. That maybe Eliza would see me. That maybe Mom would smile like she used to when I got a ribbon in 3rd grade. That maybe someone would say, "We're glad you're here." But deep down, I knew better. I knew I wasn't arriving as a guest. I was arriving as an afterthought. The waves outside my window looked like applause, but not for me. It was the sea laughing at how long I kept showing up, hoping for something different. My family didn't change. I just kept hoping they would. A few days before the wedding, I discovered I'd been quietly erased. Eliza had posted her engagement on social media, and I noticed it because a distant cousin tagged me with a congrats, but I couldn't see the original post. When I looked at Eliza's profile, there was no announcement, just pictures of white dresses, smiling faces, sparkling beaches, and flutes of champagne. There was a photo of the girls, a side-by-side snap of sisters' friends, Mom beaming. No me. Maybe I'd been forgotten. I clicked refresh. Still nothing. Then I tried from another account. And another. Blocked, invisible, removed. Curiosity and hurt propelled me further. I scrolled through other family tags. Mom wasn't tagged either, strangely. Dad's repost had only Eliza and her fiancé. Another shot of the family carefully centered between her and her new in-laws. The border cut just behind Dad's shoulder, snipping me out. Not blurred, not cropped awkwardly, it stopped precisely where I would have stood. It was purposeful. My phone shook in my hand. That frame I remembered stepping into the photograph for practice shots months earlier. Eliza had insisted on a test pose. "I want us to get this right," she said, flipping through poses with the photographer. I had been there, smiling, standing between Dad and Eliza. But now I'd been redefined as a glitch, a misprint someone to erase entirely. That evening, in my main rental by the shore, I opened messages and began typing, "Congrats, Eliza, so happy for you." It felt hollow. Every word echoed with resentment. I paused, saved it in drafts, unsent, because I refused to be polite to someone who'd pretended I didn't exist. Savoured for a moment, the draft sat unread under my thumbs, a testament to my conflicted heart. Part of me wanted to reach out the bigger person. Another, more honest version knew I'd be giving permission to erase me again. I deleted the message. Better to be the one with the final word to vanish without saying goodbye. I thought of all the times I'd shown up for them. Graduation in Annapolis. Dad stayed on a business trip and Mom said she'd come if she could. But she didn't. Instead, she sent a perfunctory text about Eliza's club tennis match. Mother's Day dinners where they never asked about deployments. The yacht club charity event last summer, I quietly donated a 6-figure sum on their behalf anonymously, but they credited donors who called their foundations, not the woman who gave her pay. This wasn't oversight, it was design. From the invitation, to the text, from the post to the repost, they'd constructed a narrative, the good sister, joyous, conforming. And then there was me, complicated, imposing, unaligned with their image. Maybe I wore a uniform. Maybe I did have rank. Maybe I was successful. But in their story, I was still the anomaly, the one who reminded them of unfamiliar values, toughness, boundary, independence. So I wrote in my journal that night, "They don't want me in the pictures. Perfect. I'll just be the voice they can't cut out." I closed my laptop and walked to the window. Above, the harbour lights flickered. Boats bobbed quietly. If I looked long enough, I could almost see my reflection on the water, fractured, rippling alive. I thought of the draftsman photographer's earlier comment. We always crop for tone. Tone. As if my presence would tarnish theirs. The irony wasn't lost on me. The uniform that signalled service was a stain. My absence was their polish. The next morning, I called my XO Ben Carter. Ben, I need you on arranging the Orion files and engagement letter now. He didn't ask why, he just said, "Yes, Admiral." After 2 decades, he knew me well. Whatever came next, I wouldn't do it alone. I packed my bag, laid out my uniform with precision, not defiantly, but with quiet confidence. If they wanted me unseen, I would show up anyway. They could crop me from pictures, they could ignore me in announcements, but they couldn't ignore me in person. In my chest, my name burned brighter than any omission Admiral Carr. I closed my eyes and travelled back to graduation day at the US Naval Academy, a day I'd replayed in my mind 1,000 times, yet each detail still stung. The brisk spring air on the West Lawn Academy brass, shining in the sunlight, and thousands of caps hurtling into the sky in unison. When the last hat landed, there was a brief moment of perfect silence, followed by uproarious applause. Every graduate met with thunderous approval, except for one. 2 seats right in the prime row remained conspicuously empty, reserved for someone who'd shown up in uniform but never really arrived. I scanned the sea of proud attendees, my heart sinking with each face I couldn't place. Then a voice whispered, "Carr." It was Commodore Haskell, retired after decades of service, the kind of man who didn't hand out praise lightly. He offered me a half smile and gently pressed a folded napkin and his private speech card into my hand. "You did good, Carr. We saw you out there. Don't let those seats define you." It was a quiet validation, a gesture far more powerful than any standing ovation from people who couldn't recognize my worth. Later that afternoon, assigned to a crowded campus pub, overflowing with post-ceremony energy, my roommate and best friend Jen draped her arm around me. "Let's celebrate properly," she said. We joined a group of classmates, plastic trays stacked with burgers, fries, soda cups sweating in summer heat, and I felt the hum of shared pride around us. But something tethered me. I was present, yet separate. My uniform felt heavy, putting me on display like a badge rather than a person. I looked across the table, laughter-tight embraces, cameras aimed at smiling faces, framed by family. I wondered if my family even knew I'd graduated today. Halfway through the cheesy fries, my phone buzzed. I toyed with ignoring it, savouring my rare moment of camaraderie. But the screen couldn't be ignored. Eliza's tournament ran long. Hope it was nice. That was it, just that. Eliza's late tennis match merited a text, but my graduation. Not enough for even a single congrats. My chest tightened. The burger tasted stale. The pub's laughter became hollow. Jen noticed my freeze. She leaned in. "What's wrong?" I showed her the message. She read it, her expression shifting from support to quiet anger. "That's..." She started, but I cut her off with a shake of my head. I had learned long ago not to give them that satisfaction. They never saw me, not really. I stabbed at my fries. Everything about this moment crystallized, the pattern achievement met with silence, success wiped with a neutral brush. When the group insisted on a toast, I raised my glass of lemonade. "To us," I said, keeping my voice calm and firm. Not for them, but for me, and for all the moments I earned that glass of celebration without wanting permission for it. Later, as dusk settled and the pub cleared, I walked back across campus. The quad lights glowed, but they didn't warm me. Beneath the magnolia trees, I remembered the flagstone bench where I'd once studied for exams alone without the promise of anyone waiting to welcome me back. As I traced the outlines of my graduation gown in my mind, I asked myself, was I defined by those 2 empty seats or by every step I took that got me here regardless of who sat beside me? I reached my dorm room and paused at the threshold. My roommate had flicked on the light and was waiting for me. She handed me a card signed by her and several classmates. "We're proud of you, Rachel," It read in clear, bold letters, "Welcome to wherever you're headed next, wherever you lead." I stared at it until my vision blurred. She didn't have to say more than that to tell me I belonged somewhere real. I held onto Commodore Haskell's napkin and Jen's card as I climbed into bed, uniform hanging carefully beside me. In that moment, a seed of something new took root, something I had never let grow before, a sense of belonging on my own terms. The realization hit me. The seats may have been empty, but my place in the world wasn't. I closed my eyes, breathing in the silence. No applause needed, just knowing I'd made it in spite of them. A week later, a thick envelope arrived at the base. Inside, a check for $5,000 and a card with 5 words, scrawled in my mother's rushed handwriting. "Get yourself something nice. Mom." No mention of the promotion. No, we're proud of you. Just that money, and a vague sense that this was supposed to pass for support. I didn't cash it. I tucked it into a file folder in the back of my footlocker, next to old orders and expired IDs. It stayed there for 2 years, quietly yellowing a symbol of everything they couldn't say out loud. Later that week, I found myself in the officer's mess, sipping lukewarm coffee, the kind that tastes more like duty than caffeine. Across the table, a junior lieutenant asked what my family said when I got my promotion. I smiled politely and said, "They sent me a check." He laughed, thinking it was a joke. I didn't correct him. What would be the point? At 2 a.m, alone in my quarters, I dug through my footlocker. There it was again, the letter, its folds crisp as though the paper had never breathed. I touched the signature at the bottom. Love, Mom. I wondered how many identical notes she'd written to her bridge group or sent inside birthday cards to distant cousins. There was no mention of my command of deployments of the 22 years I had devoted to something bigger than myself. Just buy yourself something pretty. I remembered once, maybe 10 years ago, I had called home during shore leave. Eliza had picked up. I asked her to put Mom on. "She's busy," Eliza said. "You know, with real stuff, as if deployments in the Persian Gulf peacekeeping near disputed Arctic zones didn't qualify." I had hung up without saying goodbye. The phone in my hand had felt heavier than a satellite. Success, I'd come to understand, was only celebrated when it fit their narrative. If I'd gotten married at 25, popped out a pair of blonde grandchildren, hosted holiday dinners in a clapboard house with blue shutters, they'd have applauded me. If I'd traded rank for recipe cards, I might have been their poster girl. But what I became, an officer, a strategist, a woman who could read coordinates and chart futures, they had no language for that. And so they offered money, $5,000 for a life they wouldn't acknowledge. It wasn't charity, it was erasure with a bow on it. There had been so many ways they could have said, "We see you." A framed photo in the hallway, a call on the anniversary of my commission, a seat saved at Eliza's engagement dinner. But each one of those possibilities had vanished into the air between us. And what remained was silence padded with checks and the occasional guilt-laced voicemail. When I finally did call back after that birthday message, Mum launched into details about Eliza's college applications, the venue for her bridal shower, what colour the bridesmaids might wear. 10 minutes later, she paused and said, "Anyway, you should visit sometime. We've still got your trophies in the basement." I almost laughed. The basement, that's where the evidence of my worth lived. Next to the holiday lights and tax receipts. I didn't say much that day. I never do on those calls. But after hanging up, I walked to the deck and stared at the sunset bleeding into the sea. It looked like a ribbon, red and gold and fleeting. And I realised I wasn't angry anymore. I was done asking to be seen. That night, I took out the remains of the shredded check and burned them in the small steel bin by my bunk. The pieces curled and vanished, smoke spiralling like ghosts. I stood there until nothing but ash remained, and I felt lighter, not because they were gone, but because I had finally stopped carrying them with me. That clarity carried me straight into the storm. There was no fanfare when I reported aboard the USS Helena for our North Atlantic deployment. The grey steel hull cut through fog like a knife headed into the teeth of a brewing nor'easter. The forecast called for winds over 50-knot seas that could swallow smaller vessels whole. I was scheduled for a 36-hour watch, a long stretch, but the kind that forged real character. Night fell fast and without ceremony. Rain pelted the deck like shrapnel. Our radar started acting up within hours. Static hissed louder than alarms. I watched the screen flicker as sheets of water washed over the bridge windows. My heart hammered when the console went dark, total power failure. In that silence, I heard nothing but the roar of the storm and my own breath. Damage control teams are on it. I barked into the intercom seconds before the ship shuddered. A wave crashed over the bow, sending the deck into a steep tilt. I gripped the helm until my knuckles burned. I could almost feel the ship's spine twisting under me. This vessel was my responsibility. Every soul on board, 200 sailors, my crew, my duty. I found the navigation officer in the ops room, hands dancing across backup systems. Outside, the radar was gone. Darkness swallowed us. A ship could lose power. A crew couldn't lose its nerve. I ordered a manual course correction, a maneuver only possible because I drilled for this exact scenario thousands of times. The radio crackled to life. "Admiral Carr!" "We lost a man overboard," came the voice. A midshipman washed off the deck during an equipment check. I slammed my hand on the console. "Deploy rescue boat. Now!" Seconds felt like minutes, but they launched a rigid hull inflatable into the pitch-dark storm. I stayed glued to the comms until their lights blinked back they'd found him. He was alive, drenched, terrified, but alive. I guided them home, voice steady, even as my heart clenched. The rescue team brought him aboard. His face was pale, but he was breathing. I sank into my chair afterward, rain dripping off my shoulders. 2 cups of coffee arrived, one for me, when I passed to the exhausted sailor I'd rescued. The hot liquid burned my tongue. It was nothing like Mom's offer to buy jewellery or birthday dinners in Boston. But in that moment, late against the backdrop of howling wind and blinking radar lights, it tasted like family. It was real. Our mission continued. Radar screens returned. Waves still rocked us, but we had our bearings again. The crew moved with purpose, unflinching. When the storm finally abated, dawn broke across the North Atlantic in pale light. No applause, no award ceremony, no check in the mail. Just the steady swell of the sea and the pride etched on every sailor's face. In the following weeks, I heard whispers in the mess hall. "You saved him." Quick thinking. Admiral saw what needed to be done. I didn't claim glory. My crew did it for me. That was enough. A badge forged by fire and water and human grit. One evening, under a sky of stars mirroring the endless cold ocean below, I sat with my XO Ben on the bridge wing. He offered me that same steaming mug of black coffee, no sugar, no frills. We leaned into silence, watching lights blink on the horizon. After a while, he said quietly, "Family came to me today. They wanted photos of the rescue. They want to highlight your role, but your name, your rank will remain in the background, if that's your call." I let him finish. Then I shook my head. "No. Let them remember the team, the ship, the moment." He nodded, understanding. That's who I was, a leader, not a starring image. I left the mug on the rail and stood with my hands at the ready, looking out over the water. No applause, no framed photos. Just waves and wind and the knowledge that in those rigged lights between destruction and rescue, I was home. Not in Boston. Not in their hollow accolades. As I glanced back at the radar array, I realized I hadn't sent anything home. No text, no call, no check deposit. The silence wasn't absence. It was peace. Then came Orion. A few months after the storm, We were assigned to test the new Orion-class sonar array, tilted firmly towards showcasing it to contractors from defence industries. The project was led by Admiral Croft, a man whose reputation for squeezing budgets was as well known as his disregard for safety protocols. It wasn't about the mission, it was about numbers on a spreadsheet. We slipped below the North Atlantic surface into a research zone. The seas were calm on deck, but down here currents twisted like steel cables. Croft's voice crackled over secure channels. Push the envelope. Keep sonar pings going as long as possible. The higher the readouts, the better it looks to investors. The engineers hesitated. Data logs flickered with fluctuating pressures. I walked into the control centre. Every screen was a heartbeat. I caught Croft's eye. "We have to pull back," I said. "Hull stress is approaching red. Crew safety is compromised." Croft's gaze rolled. "Admiral, this is business. We stay the course. Record the data." "Not on my ship," I replied. "You'll have your test when conditions are safe. Until then, I'm standing down." Static filled the channel. I expected pushback. Instead, Croft updated our orders electronically. Less confrontation, more corporate strategy. But the damage was done. I had overruled him. The whisper network started. My refusal was unthinkable. But I couldn't sacrifice lives to line pockets. We surfaced at first light. Croft was waiting on deck. His eyes were cold. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. Instead, he walked past me, arms folded. A board member from Lockheed stepped on board with a press team in tow. Their mouths curved in polite smiles. I offered a formal greeting, but all eyes were on the sonar tech and the investor entourage. That evening, after the briefing, I reported to a secure communications room and dialed home. I found Dad on the line. Before I could speak, he asked, "So, stocks?" When I froze, he repeated, "Lockheed stock. What happened?" There was no emotion in his voice, just calculated interest. Not about me. About their gain. I closed my eyes. I chose crew safety. Silence. Then he cleared his throat and said, "Well, that's commendable." But my gut told me that commendation carried a price. Later, alone in my cabin, I saw an old memory flash, a moment 13 years ago when I was 13 and had declared I wanted to join the Navy. My father had sat me down, his face pale under the kitchen lights of our home in New Hampshire. He'd smiled, but there was a ruthless clarity in his tone. "Women are born to be mothers, not officers. The Navy isn't your place." I had backed down that day. I had worked twice as hard to prove him wrong. But his words never left me until I saved my ship by being his exact opposite. Footsteps echoed in the corridor. Ben Carter, my executive officer, entered. He didn't knock. He closed the door behind him and held out an envelope, the kind typed and stamped, but worn at the edges. Inside was a small note wrapped around a single cigarette. I recognised the handwriting, his own calm script. Debt paid forward. RC. That was it, 3 letters. He stepped forward and said, "Admiral, I owe you my life. You did this for all of us." I looked at him. His face was quiet kindness lit by the dim red glow of console lights. No spectacle, no show, just gratitude. I crushed the cigarette in my palm. "That's not necessary," I said softly. But he'd started to go, so I added, "Thank you." He nodded once and left. In the faint hum that was our ship's heartbeat, I felt for the first time that my father's words had lost their power. I hadn't just defied a man, I'd upheld an oath. The next day, documents arrived. I was reprimanded officially. Cargo delays data integrity, individual refusal to execute orders. A low-level write-up, nothing dramatic, no board hearings, no Broadway exit, just quiet words on paper, unsatisfactory conduct under extreme circumstances. My chest tightened. I'd expected outrage. Instead, it was dismissal. Label me the problem, not the real one. Down in the galley over stale coffee, a petty officer came by and quietly said, "Thank you, ma'am. You did right." That weight of honest appreciation dropped in my chest heavier than any medal. Later, Ben found me in the sonar deck tracing the map of the deep ocean on the screen. He slid the folded note into my pocket. "Keep it," he said. "You earned it." I stared at him. He waited a long moment, then walked away. I opened his note, debt paid forward. R.C. For years I had counted the cost of being erased. Now a single moment, silent, unadvertised, taught me the truth. Family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the crew who sees you. Weeks passed. A sense of calm settled after the storm, an Orion drama, but that peace was interrupted in the quiet hours of a Monday morning by an unmarked package at my cabin door. Inside, nestled among crumpled tissue paper, were pristine white lilies and a handwritten note. To my daughter, after 20 years of silence, I finally see your strength. Love, Dad. My breath caught. It wasn't a grand gesture, but the silence between the lines was louder than any apology I'd ever craved. I placed the flowers on my desk, their petals catching the overhead lights. I left them there for days untouched. Finally, I let them wilt naturally. I didn't discard them. I let them return to dust as my resentment had no ceremony, no speech, just quiet release. 2 days later, my phone rang. The caller ID was Dad. I hesitated, then took it, standing in the narrow corridor outside the wardroom. "Rachel," he began, voice softer than I'd ever heard. I know things have been distant, but your sister's fiancé is in talks with Admiral Croft's company. They're bidding on upgrades to that sonar. You know it better than anyone. Could you maybe give us some insight?" Just a little push. I felt a hollow drop. This wasn't "hello, did you get the flowers?" This was business, masked as family. "Dad," I said, voice tight, "I'm not here for business favours. I'm here for duty and the lives on board this ship." There was a pause. He said flatly, "Think of the family name. Think of Eliza." I hung up. Later that day, Mum called. She left 3 messages. Her tone morphed from betrayal. "You always disappoint us to guilt. Family needs you now, to subtle manipulation. You're the only sister who can help Eliza have a great wedding. They tried to pull every emotional lever. Pride, loyalty, sisterhood." I didn't reply. That evening, as the sun bled over the horizon, my phone buzzed again. This time, Eliza. Her voice trembled. "Rachel, I don't understand. Dad just wants a small detail. It won't cost anything. It's about family support." I closed my eyes. "Eliza, this isn't small. He's asking me to risk my oath to compromise security for private gain." She burst into tears. "You're so black and white," she pleaded. "Can't you bend just a little?" Her desperation stabbed me. But more than that, I felt pity for both of us. I remembered being 13. I told Dad I wanted to enlist at Annapolis. His voice had dropped to ice. Women are born to be mothers, not officers. He smiled when he said it, but his look said more. I had backed down then. I had spent a lifetime proving him wrong. Yet here he was, again asking me to betray everything I'd built for their image, for Eliza's facade. I swallowed hard, voice calm. "I won't be Uncle Sam's officer just so you can have a better wedding buzzword or a business advantage. I stand for more than that," she cried, voice cracking. "You're ruining my day, my life," I said gently. "No, I'm saving it from compromises you don't even see." She hung up. I walked to the deck. The sea was glass reflecting calm skies. I breathed in salt and quiet confidence. They wanted me when I was compliant. When I commanded, they flinched. I wasn't broken or angry, I was reshaped. I had traded their obedience for my integrity. Back in my cabin, I dug out a black pen and wrote in my journal, "This isn't heartbreak, it's clarity. They need me only when I serve their comfort. I serve a higher purpose, and that's enough. I paused. That night, I didn't sleep. Not with anxiety, but with resolve. My silence was no longer absence. It was declaration. The package arrived 2 days before the wedding, wrapped in navy blue paper and tied with a cream ribbon. I had spent weeks tracking it down, a vintage brass marine compass, carefully restored its lid, engraved with coordinates 42.3601 and N 71.0589 W Boston Harbor, the place where our grandparents had first met during the war. I thought it was poetic, anchored, a piece of family legacy passed from someone who served to someone who never would, a symbolic bridge. I didn't expect Eliza to cry, but I also didn't expect what came next. I handed her the box during the rehearsal dinner, quietly without fanfare. She tore the paper with one hand while sipping wine with the other. When she opened the lid and saw the compass, her brow furrowed. "What is this?" she asked loud enough for the bridesmaids nearby to turn their heads. "It's a compass," I said. "A real one. From the 1940s. It belonged to a naval navigator. I had it restored. Those coordinates are where Grandma and Grandpa met." She blinked. "Oh," her voice went flat. She turned it in her hands, then placed it on the table next to her plate like it was a side dish. A few minutes later, a waiter nearly swept it away with the dessert plates. I had to lean forward and rescue it. Later, I overheard her tell one of her friends, "Rachel got me some old Navy thing. It's like weird compass energy or whatever. Weird compass energy." That phrase stuck with me all night. I sat at the far end of the long white rehearsal table, picking at my salad, trying to ignore the cascade of inside jokes I wasn't a part of. My dress itched, my shoes pinched. But what dug deepest was how invisible I still was. Not even intentionally erased this time, just dismissed. Like the compass. A relic. Something that belonged somewhere else. When I got back to the hotel, I placed the compass on the nightstand. I turned it slowly, watching the needle settle north again and again, no matter how many times I spun it. It didn't care about trends or Instagram captions or matching bridesmaids' robes. It just pointed true. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at that steady little arrow. It had survived salt, storm, maybe even war, and now it sat next to a bedside lamp in a town that only tolerated my presence. And yet, part of me still wanted to believe the gesture mattered, that somewhere deep inside, Eliza would realize it wasn't just a gift, it was me trying. Again. Always again. But the thing about giving pieces of yourself is that eventually you run out. The next morning, I found the compass shoved behind a cake box on the kitchen counter of the Airbnb where the bridesmaids were getting ready. I took it back quietly, wrapped it again. Not for them this time. For me. I called Ben that afternoon just to hear a voice that didn't require translation. "She hated it, huh?" he said after I told him. "Didn't even pretend. She doesn't deserve it. That's not the point. What is the point?" I stared at the compass in my lap. The point is, I keep giving things that mean something, and they keep pretending it's clutter. Ben was silent for a beat. Then, "Rachel, you're not a side note. I know. You're a damn admiral. You've been through hurricanes, actual ones. Stop handing your dignity to people who don't know what it's worth." I didn't answer, but I didn't disagree. That night, I placed the compass in my suitcase nestled between my service uniform and the heels I still wasn't sure I'd wear. I zipped it shut, feeling something settle in my chest. Not peace exactly, but permission. Permission to stop chasing their recognition like a lost dog sniffing for scraps. Let them call it weird. I knew what it was. It was legacy. It was direction. And above all, it was mine. The wedding day came with exchange of vows, laughter, and carefully curated moments. In the foyer, I watched as Eliza spoke with the photographer, a friend she'd chosen. They smiled and nodded. She insisted there would be a photograph to match every variation: bride and family groom and family large group, small group. I watched from the corner, wearing my uniform, daring anyone to question my place. Eliza caught my gaze for a brief second and gave me a tight half smile. No words, just the memory: I will make sure they take you. Later, during the chaos of reception, I slipped away to the dressing room to touch up my lipstick. Betty appeared carrying a small stack of cue cards. "Go ahead, Rachel," she said in that syrupy tone. "The groom's family photos are this way. You can go on and wait, they'll call you once we've set it up." She nodded at the mirror and was gone before I could respond. Her timing was perfect. I was 30 seconds late. Already the group had formed cameras trained. I stood backstage just beyond the curtain in full dress uniform, watching pockets of guests laughing, champagne flutes clinking. A moment passed, then 2, then 3. Nothing happened. Hours later, after dinner, after speeches, after cake, I walked through the grand ballroom and saw the photos on display strung above the bar, clipped with satin ribbons. There was the groomsman with the bride with her mother, the bride with Eliza with her new in-laws, and somewhere down the line, hidden or out of frame, a gap where I should have stood. I pushed past the crowd and lifted one of the framed prints from a wall planter, a candid shot of groom with his entire family. I turned it over. No caption, no date. It was unmaneuvered and lit just enough. But I knew what wasn't there. I knew whose shoulder had been removed in cropping. I remembered Betty's instructions, groom's family, only when Rachel is busy, an unspoken plan to keep me off that wall. Anger rose cold in my chest, but more than anger, it was sorrow. For years, they'd manipulated visibility like it was a game piece. And tonight, they'd removed me like I was a loose tile. For a moment, I fantasized about smashing the entire row of photos off the wall, but I didn't. Instead, I quietly lifted the frame off the hook and carried it outside onto the terrace. The air smelled of night-blooming jasmine and sea salt. I wiped the glass, clean-watched, city lights reflect off the surface. I didn't need to correct the crop. I didn't need to explain the missing figure. I just set it aside and walked back in. Back in the reception hall, I paused by the gift table. A few guests stood nearby. I saw Eliza watching from across the room, her form stiff. I ignored the finality in her posture. I walked straight past the photographs, past the tables of relatives I barely knew, and past the catering cart buzzing with wine. I went to the DJ stand. I leaned in and whispered, "Please, play something slow." The DJ nodded. A slow song began, one I'd danced with other families, at graduation, first promotion, countless military gatherings. It washed over me, soft and familiar. Then I stepped on the floor alone at first. And then a man in uniform joined me, an old friend from my first command. He didn't speak, he just stayed. Together, we danced around the empty floor where all the attention was supposed to be elsewhere. Under low lights, I felt no shame. I felt seen. When the song ended, applause rippled across the hall. Not a loud uproar, but a genuine wave of recognition. I glanced at them, younger officers, spouses, friends, none of whom were family, and I let the warmth wash through me. Later, I returned to where the photos had been. The frame was gone from the hook, leaving an empty space on the wall. I had cleaned it. I let them see a missing silhouette where I couldn't be edited. No more illusions. Just air. That night, back in my room, I wrote one sentence on a blank card I belonged to no one but myself. I tucked it into my uniform pocket. I left the compass and that memory of disappearing photos together in my luggage. The next morning, I packed up and left before breakfast. No goodbyes, no excuses, just clean departure. I arrived back at the hotel just as the morning light turned the Atlantic into brushed silver. The wedding felt like it had happened in a dream, one of those heavy, slow-motion dreams where you can't speak or move fast enough no matter how hard you try. But now, I was awake, and clarity had a different kind of weight. The room was still as I left it. Boots by the door, my uniform hung neatly in the closet, the compass in its velvet box untouched on the dresser. I stared at that box for a long time before moving. It had felt so important just days ago. A symbol, a message, but like so many things I'd offered my family, it had become clutter in the background. Noise they didn't want to hear. I sat on the edge of the bed, pulled out my laptop and opened the encrypted folder I hadn't touched since I got back stateside. Operation Orion. The incident file wasn't long bare-bones logs, a series of short memos, a buried email thread that should have never existed in the first place. But it was enough. Croft had made a decision that could have cost 42 lives. He did it for numbers on a quarterly spreadsheet, for the illusion of success to secure more funding. He told me it was a strategic gamble. I told him it was reckless endangerment. I saved the crew. And in return, he tried to erase my credibility with the Navy brass. I had let it go. Not because I was afraid, because I believed justice would eventually catch up to him. But now, after watching my own sister carefully cut me out of her photos, like an unwanted sticker, I realized silence wasn't grace. It was complicity. I typed up the memo to Ben, just enough to unlock the documents, just enough to light the fuse. I didn't need revenge. I needed truth. And I knew he'd know what to do with it. When I hit send, I didn't flinch. Outside, the sea was restless. I stepped out onto the balcony, feeling the bite of wind through my t-shirt. My old commanding officer used to say, "A calm sea is just a pause between storms. Don't mistake it for safety." That morning, I understood what he meant. Down below, tourists were strolling with lattes, laughing over pastries, snapping selfies against the backdrop of waves. I wondered how many of them had just left messy weddings, unspoken family fights, expectations that didn't fit. We don't all wear our scars on our skin. Some of us carry them in the silence between words. In my mind, I heard my instructor's voice again, an old Marine with eyes like broken glass. He once told me after a failed navigation drill, "Carr, your value doesn't sit in the ship's log. It's in the hands you pull from the water. It's in the direction you hold when everyone else is spinning." I hadn't understood it then. I do now. I thought about the photos I didn't appear in, the seats never filled, the text messages that made excuses instead of memories. I thought about how easy it had been for them to forget me, and how hard I had fought to be someone worth remembering. Inside, my phone buzzed. One message from Ben. Got it. Time to clean house. I exhaled slowly. It wasn't vengeance that filled me. It was certainty. I had done what I needed to do, not just for me. For every crew member who'd stood watch under my command. For every young woman who thought she had to be small to be accepted. For every version of me who ever sat alone waiting for applause that never came. I left the balcony door open and let the salt air fill the room. I didn't pack, not yet. I just sat there, surrounded by that strange kind of quiet that feels like the eye of a hurricane. Not because danger is gone, but because something powerful is about to move. It started with the clink of a wine glass. Just one tapping against another. A polite sound, a background note in the soft saccharine hum of wedding music. I had just settled into my chair at the edge of the reception hall, the kind of seat reserved for second cousins or ex-nannies. Still in uniform, though I'd hesitated that morning standing in front of the mirror debating once again. This time, I had chosen not to fold. The room was lit in gold and cream, the kind of lighting that made everyone look better than they were. Everyone but me. I was visible and yet utterly unseen. I sipped from my glass of seltzer like it was champagne and let the conversations blur into a static of laughter and toasts I wasn't part of. Then, the microphone screeched slightly, and I saw Ben walk toward the small platform near the head table. He wasn't part of the wedding party, so his presence there made a few heads turn. His tux was slightly askew the way he always wore his dress clothes, like they were borrowed. He cleared his throat, and then he said it. "Ladies and gentlemen," he started, his voice steady, cutting through the noise. "Before the next toast, I'd like to acknowledge someone in this room." I looked down. Already, I could feel it, the tension across my back, the hum in my ears. "Don't. Please don't," he continued. "Rear Admiral Rachel Carr." Silence. Not a rustle. Not a breath. Just a full stop in the middle of celebration. Ben turned. "Ma'am," he said loud and clear, and gave a salute. A real one, formal, flawless. It landed in the room like a thunderclap. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. People turned toward me, eyes darting. Eliza's champagne glass froze midair. My mother's lips parted just slightly, like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the script. I stood. I hadn't planned to, but my body knew. I returned the salute, not performatively, not proudly, just honestly. That moment belonged to neither of us. It belonged to truth. And truth, I've learned, is louder than applause. Eliza blinked several times, her face locked somewhere between disbelief and fury. I could almost hear her thinking, "You just couldn't let me have this." I felt the old instinct rise in me to shrink, to apologize for existing too loudly. But I didn't. Not this time. Someone near the back of the room, a woman I didn't know, began to clap. Just once. Then again. And then more joined. It wasn't thunderous, but it didn't need to be. It was honest. The MC fumbled with his cards, unsure how to recover. Eliza shot up from her seat, her voice low but sharp. "You said you wouldn't make this about you." "I didn't," I replied. "He did." She shook her head, stepping closer. "Why do you always have to ruin everything?" I stared at her. Not angry, just clear. "Eliza, I said this was never about me. But maybe, just once, it shouldn't have to be about hiding me either." She looked at me, then not like a sister, not like family. Just a woman, staring at a truth she didn't want to reckon with. Behind her I caught Dad's eyes. He didn't nod. He didn't frown. He just looked away. Ben walked off the platform like nothing had happened. No smirk, no victory lap. He just returned to his seat and resumed his drink. I remained standing for a few more seconds, my hands calm at my sides. And then I sat back down. No one came over. No one said thank you. But no one erased me this time. That in itself was everything. They didn't say thank you. They didn't have to. The silence around me had changed no longer, void but acknowledgement. I sat there for a moment longer, soaking it in until a subtle shift in the room's energy made me turn. A man in dress blues had stepped up near the platform. Commander Hollis, retired, former XO of the Orion. I hadn't seen him in 3 years, not since the inquiry. He adjusted the microphone slightly and cleared his throat. "I wasn't scheduled to speak," he said, voice steady, but low enough that only those paying attention would hear. "But I feel something important's been left unsaid. The Orion incident. That rescue, it wasn't luck. It wasn't a fluke. It was Rear Admiral Rachel Carr. She disobeyed a direct order because that order would have gotten my crew killed. I owe her my life. And if the Navy still values truth, it owes her more than that." The words hit like quiet thunder. Not shouted, not dramatized, just placed gently, unmistakably into the open air. A slow murmur rippled across the room. Croft, who had been hovering near the champagne bar, stiffened, his jaw clenched. Then came another ripple, this time in the form of a sharply dressed officer walking toward him, a man I didn't recognize, but immediately read as Naval Investigative Service. He didn't say a word, just handed Croft a thick manila envelope. Croft didn't open it. He didn't argue. He simply nodded, face paling, and walked out of the reception hall as if he were disappearing down the corridor of a sinking ship. Nobody applauded. Nobody stopped him either. I kept my eyes forward. Eliza didn't. She turned in her chair, her mouth slightly open, her hand trembling near the edge of the tablecloth. Her wine glass tipped slightly and stilled. I met her eyes, and for the first time in years, she didn't look away. She stood slowly and walked toward me, steps careful, like she was walking a tightrope. When she stopped beside my chair, I could see her fingers curled into her palm nails, pressing half-moons into her skin. "Did you plan this?" she whispered. Her voice wasn't accusatory, not yet. It was raw, as if disbelief was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. "No," I answered quietly, but I didn't stop it either. Her breath hitched, her face flushed with something between shame and fury. "You ruined my wedding." I tilted my head just slightly. If your wedding depended on a lie staying buried, then maybe it wasn't built to last. Her eyes shimmered, but not with tears, with a storm trying hard not to spill over. "You always have to make it about you. Your uniform, your damn righteousness. You couldn't just let me have one day." I stood not to confront, but to meet her where she was. I wasn't trying to take your day. I just didn't want to keep erasing myself so you could feel whole. That stopped her. For a second, her lips parted, but no words came out. She looked down at the floor, then back at me. Her voice came softer this time, barely audible. "I didn't know about the Orion. I thought it was just more of your control." "I know," I said. "I didn't ask them to cut you out of the pictures," she murmured. "That wasn't me. I know," I repeated. "But you didn't stop it either." She swallowed. I could see the apology rise in her throat like a tide she wasn't ready to release. And that was fine. I didn't need it anymore. She turned and walked back to her table, the distance between us, now mapped out in choices hers and mine. I didn't follow. Ben passed me on his way back from the bar, his eyes scanning mine. "You okay?" he asked under his breath. I nodded once. Better than okay. The music resumed, small talk resumed, laughter resumed, but something had shifted. People kept their distance, but this time not from shame, from recognition, like they knew better than to pretend I hadn't been here hadn't mattered. I walked to the edge of the reception hall, stood near the glass doors that opened onto the balcony. The sea stretched beyond the railing, dark, vast, and unapologetic. Behind me, I heard a little voice. "Admiral," I turned. A girl, maybe 7 or 8, stood there in a flower crown slightly askew and clutching a piece of folded paper. She held it out with both hands. I took it. It was a crayon drawing. A ship clearly meant to be a Navy vessel, cutting through waves with a woman in uniform at the helm. Next to the drawing was a single sentence, messy but readable. "My dad said you saved his life." I looked back at the girl. "Who's your dad?" She pointed across the room. Hollis, now talking with an older couple, caught my eye and gave a small nod. "Tell him he raised a remarkable daughter," I said. She smiled and ran off. I folded the picture carefully and slipped it into my coat. The truth had waited long enough, and finally it had stood tall without asking for permission. I left the reception hall quietly, stepping out into the cool evening air. There was no fanfare, no applause, but the silence carried weight, the kind that comes after something finally breaks loose. The next day, I found myself at a small cafe near the harbour, sipping black coffee when a little girl approached me. She couldn't have been more than 8, with wind-tangled hair and a folded piece of paper clutched in her hand. "Are you Admiral Rachel Carr?" she asked, eyes wide and serious, in that way only children manage. I nodded, caught off guard. She unfolded the paper, revealing a crayon drawing of a grey ship with a tall radar tower, waves splashing at its bow. A figure stood on deck in a white uniform, arms raised not in salute, but as if steadying the whole vessel. "My dad says you saved him. He was on the Orion." My breath caught. "Your dad's name?" I asked. "Matthew Hines," she said. And just like that, the name unspooled a memory, his bloody shoulder, the storm, the sound of metal groaning under pressure. I remembered pulling him out from under collapsed beams, his face pale but eyes stubbornly focused on me. I remembered shouting coordinates and refusing Croft's command to retreat. "He said, you were the reason he came home," she added. "He says he wouldn't be my dad if it weren't for you." I crouched down to her level, looked at the drawing again. "This is yours," she nodded. "I made it for you." I took it with both hands like it was a military commendation. "Thank you," I whispered. Back in my hotel room, I took the Labanra, the one I had gifted Eliza, the one that had been so carelessly discarded near a pile of napkins. Its brass edge was still polished, the coordinates engraved on its lid, latitude and longitude of where our grandparents had gotten married off the coast of Nova Scotia. I placed the compass beside the drawing on the desk. For the first time, they looked like they belonged together. One a symbol of legacy, the other of impact. Neither had found their place at the wedding, but here together they made sense. Later that week, I received an invitation to the official memorial for the Orion. The Navy was finally acknowledging the sacrifice, the near tragedy, the heroism mine included. My name was listed among the honorees. At the ceremony, I stood in front of a new bronze plaque. It was embedded in stone overlooking the sea, inscribed with the names of those who had led, who had protected, who had refused to abandon ship. My name, Rear Admiral Rachel Carr, was third from the top. I touched the metal fingers, tracing the grooves. It felt like more than recognition. It felt like permanence. Behind me, Ben appeared. No uniform this time, just a navy blue blazer and a calm, steady smile. "I told you I'd remember," he said. "And I told you I wasn't going anywhere," I replied. We stood there for a while, just watching the tide roll in. The sea was calm that day, deceptively soft, like it had forgotten how to rage. I thought about everything that had brought me here, the missed birthdays, the silent treatments, the condescension disguised as concern, but also the steel decks beneath my boots, the lives I had helped steer back to safety, and the small unspoken bonds forged in storms. For most of my life, I had measured myself by the yardsticks others handed me. Family approval, societal boxes, traditions I was never meant to fit into. But standing there, I realised I had stopped needing their frame to feel complete. I was never the black sheep. I was the compass, the one who charted unfamiliar waters, who found direction in chaos, who chose to navigate forward when others clung to the dock. I looked down at the drawing again. The ship, the sea, the figure in white. It wasn't just me, it was every version of me that had fought to stay upright. The girl in the empty auditorium, the woman in the engine room, the sister in the background. They were all here, finally stitched together by truth. As I left the ceremony, I didn't take the main road back. I drove along the cliffs, letting the coastline guide me. Every mile felt like reclaiming something. By the time I reached the overlook, the sun had dipped low enough to cast a trail of gold across the water. I pulled over, took out the compass and the drawing, and left them on the bench overlooking the sea. Not as a tribute to the past, but as a marker of where I had landed, where I had chosen to stand. I am not the daughter they erased. I am not the shadow in the photographs. I am the one who pointed the way. And finally, I chose my own. Maybe you felt like that too, like a footnote in your own story, waiting for permission to be seen. But here's the truth, you don't need permission. You never did. Your worth isn't written in someone else's caption or found in who shows up for you, but in who you've become despite who didn't. If this story echoed something inside you, if it made you pause, maybe even made you feel a little less alone, then stay with us. There are more stories like this, and maybe even a place for yours too. You're not invisible, you're just getting started. Subscribe if you'd like to walk this road with us. With